Hello, I'm Mario Toneguzzi, Managing Editor of Canada's Entrepreneur. Joining me today is Todd Hirsch, Economist, Keynote Speaker and Author. Thanks for joining us today, Todd.
Thanks for having me back, Mario.
Okay, let's talk about a couple of different things, but first, I want to talk to you about interest rates. Now, the Bank of Canada this week signaled that it wasn't doing anything with the interest rates, holding steady.
Yeah.
Uh, Let me first ask you, Todd, what were the reasons, or do you think the reasons were behind that move or non-move?
It, yeah, it's so interesting. And, having worked many years ago at the Bank of Canada, I've had a chance to sort of peek behind the curtain and how monetary policy is set. And it would be fascinating to be part of those conversations right now. The Bank of Canada is still in this holding pattern, like they were at their last fixed announcement date, so this is the second time in a row they have not budged on rates. But they're still stuck between this rock and a hard place. They see the Canadian economy sort of softening, a lot of it due to tariff uncertainty and oil price declines and all sorts of things. So normally their instinct would be to cut rates, sort of to juice up the economy a bit. On the other hand, they are still concerned about inflation pressures, and they don't like where those numbers have been trending. And if there are going to be reciprocal tariffs from Canada, and we don't know what that's all going to look like, that's going to push inflation up even higher. So it's this push and pull, this tug of war between a soft economy, but inflation still sort of in the background. The Bank of Canada said, we're still not prepared to make any move at this point. But they did sort of indicate, Tiff Macklem, the governor, in his statements, he did sort of imply that they are more inclined to ease later on this year. In other words, I think that on balance, the weight of the tariff uncertainty and the slowing of the Canadian economy is going to be a bigger concern for them than inflation. But for now, they took a pass and kept rates where they're at.
So what does that mean, for the average Joe and Josephine out there, the fact that nothing's happened with the interest rates?
Well, this is the other really interesting thing about financial markets right at the moment. Normally, if the Bank of Canada were to cut interest rates, and a lot of people were hoping they would, that would make mortgages and lending, borrowing costs for your average borrower, it would make it less expensive. But at the same time, the bond market is doing something different. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this, but the bond market is really what sets mortgage rates. It's the 5-year bond market that banks will price their mortgage products against. The Bank of Canada and Tiff Macklem, they will influence it. But at the end of the day, it's what the 5-year bond market is doing. And those interest rates have actually been trending a little higher. So all of this is to say, normally in normal times, homeowners or borrowers or home building companies would love to have seen the Bank of Canada cut interest rates yesterday, but it probably wouldn't be making that much difference anyway when it comes to going and renewing your mortgage or getting a mortgage.
Yeah. Okay. Now you mentioned tariffs.
The T word.
Explain to me like where we're at with this thing because
Oh,
it changed so many times in the last couple of months. It's hard to keep track of.
it is hard to keep track of. And it seemed for a while there was a bit of a reprieve. We weren't hearing too much. But, then this week, Donald Trump, he must have had a bad golf game because he said, I'm increasing, just sort of out of the blue. Steel and aluminum tariffs are going from 25% to 50%. And this is terrible news. It's almost the nail in the coffin for Canadian steel and aluminum, at least in the short run, until we can find other buyers. Uh, but this sort of it came out of the blue. It's sort of random. We're still in that holding pattern, though. Overall, the 90-day reprieve that Donald Trump gave way back in April, I guess it was, or maybe it was beginning of April on Liberation Day, and markets went insane and stock markets were collapsing and everyone went crazy. And Donald Trump said, okay, 90-day reprieve. Well, we're kind of running out of that. I think end of June will be the end of the 90-day pause on tariffs. who knows what's going to happen then? If we're lucky, maybe Donald Trump will be consumed with other bigger issues. Maybe the tragedies in Russia and Ukraine, like he's trying to solve that. Maybe he'll be distracted by some other things and he'll forget to reinstate the tariffs. I don't know if that's a very good bet. I think that we can anticipate there's going to be more tariff tantrums coming up. But all of this is to say, I mean, honestly, if anyone can tell what's going through Donald Trump's, head right now on tariffs, they're doing better than most of us.
All right. The last thing I want to talk to you about, and not to get political, but there's a lot of talk in this country about no federal budget, right? And we've
Yeah.
got a new government in, we've got a new prime minister, yet there's a signal that there's no budget till perhaps the fall. What does that mean? From an economic point of view, and businesses and Canadian general people, like, what does it mean to have no budget out there?
Well, for average Canadians, it means absolutely nothing. Like it really doesn't, it means nothing. If you are a government watcher or if you're an opposition leader, you're going to want to kind of press the government for these things. And I don't know. I mean, I've never worked in the finance department. My understanding is it's an enormous amount of work to put together a budget. And that most of that work isn't done by the prime minister or the finance minister. It's done by the bureaucrats. And you can't really just walk in there and say, hey, we need a new budget in 2 weeks. These things take months if you're going to build it out properly. I do have a little bit of sympathy and compassion for this incoming government. They've got a very short parliamentary session before summer. I don't think for most Canadians, the average Canadian is not going to miss a budget. On the other hand, I think it is a good question for the opposition leaders to ask. Look, if we're really in this kind of crisis you're talking about, should we be having summer holidays for parliamentarians? If it's that big of a crisis, could we not have extended the session into July, which is unconventional? They all like to do the hot dog and barbecue circuit, and I understand that. But if this is really a crisis, I think it's a good question that the Prime Minister maybe should ask. But honestly, for most Canadians, a budget makes no difference at all. They're not sitting and worrying. They're worrying, how am I going to pay bills and buy groceries? They're not as worried about a political document like a budget.
Okay, now, so explain this to me. I'm, not an economist, okay, just an average citizen out there, and I hear always these talks about deficits and debt, right? That the government has, and you have organizations like the Canadian Taxpayers Federation that goes nuts about the rising level of debt this country has.
Mm-hmm.
Explain to me, like, if I go into debt, I'm owing money to somebody, right? Or some organization. Who does the country owe money to then when it goes in?
Well, I guess, yeah, it depends on the country. When the government of Canada, for example, the federal government, it needs to raise money in the bond market, it'll go to New York or Toronto or other financial centers, and anyone can buy those. Most Canadians, if they have kind of a diversified portfolio of savings or investment from their retail bank, almost certainly they have Government of Canada 5-year or 10-year bonds in their portfolio. So a lot of that money is, they're borrowing it from Canadians, but they could be borrowing it from investors in other countries. Other governments will sometimes buy other government bonds. People in Asia or the Middle East will buy Government of Canada bonds. And at least at present, the Government of Canada, while the deficit is high and the debt is mounting, and that is a serious problem, we still have room on our credit card. I don't want to make light of that because I do think deficits and debt does matter. But for the time being, people are still willing to lend us money. And that's a good thing. It just can't be abused. This can't go on forever. At certain points, and we've seen countries like Greece before they joined the EU, they kept running to the end of their credit card limit and then they would default and their currency would collapse and it all starts over again. And no one will, lend them money. Then the interest rates are much, much higher because you're riskier. Canada, we're still a good bet for people, when they go to the bond market, people will still buy Government of Canada bonds, but it comes with a caveat that can't go on forever.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much, Todd, for joining us again today.
Thanks, Mario. It's always fun.
Hey, that was Todd Hirsch, who is a economist, keynote speaker, and author. I'm Mario Toneguzzi, managing editor of Canada's Entrepreneur. Thanks for joining us today.